They told you history was written in ink. They never told you it was erased in fire. On a humid April morning in 1868, a man walked into a room filled with 23 years of secrets, locked the door, and burned the truth until it screamed. By the time the smoke touched the sky, he was gone. And what he destroyed was never meant for your eyes. But tonight, you're going to see it. You weren't supposed to know this story. Men like you, hungry for what hides behind polished narratives, are dangerous. Because once you see how power protects itself, you stop worshiping it. Once you understand how systems bury their sins, you stop trusting the surface. This is not just a story about a plantation overseer. It's about control. It's about records. It's about the architecture of silence. In 1868, the war had ended, but the machinery of domination had not. It had only evolved. The chains were gone, but contracts replaced them. The whips were hidden, but hunger enforced obedience just as effectively. And in rural Mississippi, at a decaying estate called Bellwood, one man understood something the rest pretended not to see. His name was Nathaniel Gisham. For 23 years, he documented everything: births, deaths, punishments, sales, separations. He wrote it all down with surgical precision. Ink as cold as iron, columns straight, numbers clean, order imposed on chaos. Because that's how men justify evil. They systematize it, they catalog it, they turn suffering into data. But then something changed. 3 weeks before federal lawyers were scheduled to subpoena those records, Gisham locked himself inside that room and read everything he had ever written. Page after page, name after name, a ledger of human despair. And on April 14th, 1868, he chose fire. Not to confess, not to surrender, but to decide, on behalf of history, what would be remembered and what would disappear. That decision should disturb you, because it reveals something most men never question. Power doesn't just commit crimes, it curates memory. And if you think this is only about the 19th century, you haven't been paying attention. Lean closer, because this is where the descent begins.
The smoke from Bellwood did not rise in panic. It rose in discipline. No frantic neighbors, no desperate attempts to salvage pages, no servants running with buckets. The fire was contained, surgical almost, respectful, as if it understood its assignment. Destroy only what matters. When authorities arrived, they found a room reduced to gray powder and twisted iron bindings. The shelves still stood. The desk was intact. The safe had been opened deliberately, not broken. The windows were latched from the inside. Nathaniel Gisham was nowhere to be found. But what truly unsettled the federal investigator assigned to the case wasn't the disappearance. It was the absence of accident. There were no scorch marks outside the records room, no spread, no chaos, just ash where 23 years of meticulous documentation had once lived. Someone had curated oblivion. The timing was not coincidence. In 1868, Reconstruction was tightening its grip across the South. The federal government sought proof, evidence of illegal labor practices, fraudulent contracts, covert re-enslavement through debt peonage. Paper trails mattered now. Ledgers could indict. And Bellwood's records were rumored to be thorough. Too thorough. You see, overseers like Gisham were not merely enforcers, they were archivists of dominance. Every whipping, every withheld ration, every child sold south before the war, they logged it all.
The plantation system survived on documentation. Efficiency required memory. But Reconstruction threatened that memory, because memory can prosecute, and prosecution can dismantle empires. 3 weeks before the subpoena, witnesses claimed Gisham had begun acting strangely. He stopped attending church. He avoided town meetings. He stayed up at night in the records room, oil lamp flickering until dawn. One former stable hand, who later testified anonymously, said he heard something through the door. Not weeping, not prayer, reading. Reading names aloud, one after another, as if he were weighing them, as if he were deciding their fate. And here is where the story bends. Because if Gisham burned the records to protect himself, he failed. His disappearance made him a suspect forever. But if he burned them to protect others, to prevent indictments that might unravel more powerful men, then he was not acting alone. Think carefully. An overseer was a middleman, replaceable, disposable. But plantation owners, bankers, politicians who financed cotton expansion before the war and quietly invested in convict leasing after, they were not replaceable. And if those ledgers contained signatures, financial ties, proof of collusion, then the fire at Bellwood wasn't destruction. It was preservation, not of truth, of power. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. When history goes silent, who benefits? Because sometimes the absence of evidence is not innocence, it's strategy. And Bellwood was not the only archive that vanished in 1868. Not even close.
The graves were not discovered by accident. They were found because someone miscalculated a foundation line. On a humid afternoon in 1950, just outside Baton Rouge, a construction crew was laying groundwork for a small industrial storage facility. The land had once belonged to the Bellwood estate, though by then no one used that name anymore. It was simply Lot 47, cheap acreage, unremarkable, cleared and sold after the war, until the shovels hit something that wasn't soil. Wood first, then bone. The workers thought it was a single coffin. Old land sometimes hides old burials. But when they cleared the dirt carefully, they saw something that didn't make sense. There was no coffin, just bodies, laid side by side, neatly aligned. No markers, no stones, no names. The sheriff was called. He arrived irritated, expecting a minor delay. Instead, he found a trench, longer than a single grave should be. As more soil was removed, the pattern emerged. A row, then another. They weren't scattered, they were arranged, as if cataloged underground. And here's what made the sheriff's stomach tighten: the depth. These were not recent burials. The soil had compacted in layers that suggested decades, almost a century, which meant these graves predated the construction, predated the property sale, possibly even predated the war. But Bellwood's burial registry, what little survived the 1868 fire, listed only 12 recorded deaths during Nathaniel Gisham's tenure. 12. What they had already uncovered by sunset was more than 30 bodies. No plaques, no religious symbols, no coffin hardware, no personal effects, nothing to identify them. Almost as if identification had been deliberately stripped. And then came the detail that never made the newspapers: the wrists. Several skeletons showed signs of healed fractures, small, tight breaks consistent with prolonged binding. Iron residue was found near 2 rib cages, corrosion stains where shackles may have once rested before decaying. But here's the detail that truly unsettled the coroner: the positioning. The hands weren't folded peacefully over the chest. They were placed flat against the thighs. Uniform, disciplined, as if arranged by someone who valued order. By nightfall, word spread quietly among older black residents in the nearby parish. They did not appear surprised. One elderly woman, born in 1872, reportedly told her grandson, "They finally dug up the silence." Think about that. Finally. Which means someone always knew. The site was quickly fenced. Construction halted for only 4 days before state officials stepped in. The remains were removed, boxed, labeled with numbers, not names. And then something strange happened. No federal investigation followed, no historical inquiry. The land deed changed hands again within 6 months, and Lot 47 became a warehouse. Ask yourself why. In 1950, America was rebuilding its image: post-war optimism, suburban expansion, industrial pride. Unearthing evidence of unrecorded deaths tied to a Reconstruction-era plantation didn't fit the narrative. So what's easier? Investigate a century-old crime tied to an archive and a vanished overseer, or reclassify the bones as pre-war labor burials and move on? The official report listed the cause as likely disease outbreak among plantation workers. Likely. But disease does not align bodies in rows. Disease does not erase records. Disease does not erase records. Someone wanted those graves forgotten, and when the fire erased the paper trail in 1868, the earth kept its own archive. But archives can be exhumed, and silence, when disturbed, does not stay quiet for long.
The official explanation lasted exactly 11 days. That's how long the phrase "probable cholera outbreak" stayed in local circulation before it quietly disappeared from headlines. No follow-up articles, no historical retrospectives, just a short column on page 6 of a Baton Rouge daily, then silence. But silence has weight. And in 1950, Louisiana was very familiar with the weight of silence, because by then Jim Crow wasn't a memory, it was law. Publicly revisiting unmarked graves tied to a former plantation wasn't just inconvenient, it was destabilizing. Questions about illegal burials led to questions about illegal labor. Questions about illegal labor led to questions about inherited wealth. And inherited power does not enjoy archaeology. The county coroner's preliminary notes contained something else, something that never made it into the final report. 3 of the skulls showed blunt force trauma. Not identical fractures, not uniform damage, but clear, deliberate impacts. Pre-mortem, meaning the injuries occurred before death. He wrote it plainly in pencil. Possible violence. By the time the report was typed and archived, the phrase had been replaced with environmental degradation consistent with agricultural labor. Environmental degradation. That's how you rename suffering. But here's what truly complicates the narrative. Among the bones, they found something metal, not shackles, not tools, a tag. Small, oval, corroded, stamped with a number. Just a number. Now pause here. Plantations in the 19th century often assigned inventory numbers to tools, to livestock, to shipments, but sometimes to people, especially when documentation mattered more than identity. If Bellwood kept records, meticulous records, and those records burned in 1868, then what if the graves were never meant to be named? What if they were meant to be counted? Numbers are easier to erase than names, because numbers don't demand memory. They don't haunt descendants. They don't testify. And if Overseer Nathaniel Gisham read names aloud before the fire, as the stable hand claimed, perhaps he wasn't choosing who to protect. Perhaps he was deciding who would disappear twice, first in life, then in record. Here's where the story tightens. In 1951, less than a year after the graves were unearthed, the warehouse built on Lot 47 changed ownership again. The new investor group included a banking firm whose founding partner traced lineage directly back to Bellwood's primary financier in the 1850s. That's not rumor, that's land deed history. The soil remembers ownership even when it forgets bodies. And ownership, Ahmad, is the quiet thread running through all of this. Because when graves surface, they threaten more than reputation. They threaten inheritance. So the bones were boxed, filed as archaeological remains, stored in a parish facility, and gradually misplaced. Not destroyed, not acknowledged, misplaced, which is a bureaucratic way of saying you will not find them again. But here's the truth no one says aloud. Unmarked graves are not accidents. They are decisions. And decisions, once made, echo, even if you burn the records, even if you box the bones, even if you rename the land. The earth does not collaborate forever. Sometimes it returns what was hidden, and when it does, it asks a question history never answered. Who was being protected?
By 1952, the boxes were gone. No official transfer record, no disposal certificate, no university archive claim, just a gap. The parish clerk later testified, off the record, decades later, that he remembered signing something related to temporary relocation for state review. He couldn't recall the department, he couldn't recall the official's name, but he remembered the feeling. They were in a hurry, he said, like the bones had a deadline. Think about that. Bones with a deadline. Why would century-old remains require urgency? Because evidence ages differently than memory. Memory fades, evidence accuses. And if the graves tied back to Bellwood, and Bellwood tied back to investors, and investors tied forward into modern institutions, then those bones were not historical artifacts. They were liabilities. Now here's something rarely discussed in local history circles. Between 1865 and 1877, during Reconstruction, Louisiana saw a surge in convict leasing. Newly freed black men were arrested on minor charges, fined beyond their means, and leased to plantations, railroads, and industrial projects. It was slavery by paperwork. And paperwork, as we know, burns. But bodies remain. If the graves on Lot 47 were not pre-war burials, if they were post-war convict laborers, that changes everything. Because convict leasing records from that parish are incomplete. Missing pages, lost contracts, discontinued logs beginning in 1868, the same year Bellwood's records burned. Coincidence or coordination? Consider this. Overseers were often retained after emancipation. They simply changed titles: labor supervisor, field manager, same authority, same methods, different vocabulary. What if Nathaniel Gisham didn't disappear? What if he transitioned? No obituary was ever found, no grave marked with his name, no census entry confirmed his death. But there is a curious entry in 1870. A in Gresham appears in a neighboring parish, listed as a corrections contractor. Corrections contractor, which is another way to say he managed prisoners. Names shift, spelling adjusts, history blurs, but power remains consistent. And if Gisham oversaw laborers who were legally classified as prisoners, deaths could be explained. Cholera, heat exhaustion, escape attempts. No need for headstones, no need for families notified. Prisoners were property of the state, temporary bodies, replaceable labor. Now return to the graves. Uniform rows, number tag 17, healed fractures consistent with restraint, blunt force trauma, no religious markers, no coffins. Does that resemble a family burial plot or inventory disposal? Here's the part that unsettles historians the most. If those were convict laborers buried without record, and if the records that documented their contracts burned intentionally, then the fire in 1868 wasn't about protecting past slavery. It was about protecting its evolution. Because slavery did not vanish, it adapted, and the archive was its shield. When that shield threatened to expose too much, it vanished. Ahmad, imagine standing on Lot 47 in 1950, the air thick, the soil disturbed, workers uneasy, and beneath your feet a century-old decision rising to the surface, a decision to number instead of name, to align instead of mourn, to burn instead of confess. The question isn't whether the graves were intentional. The question is who signed off on forgetting them, and how many systems since then were built on the comfort of that forgetting. Because some foundations are not poured with concrete, they are poured with silence, and silence, when inherited, becomes structure.
In 1963, something strange happened to Lot 47. Not publicly strange, quietly strange. The warehouse that had stood there for 13 years was demolished without announcement. No major damage reported, no structural collapse, just a permit filed for redevelopment. The land sat empty for nearly 2 years afterward. 2 years. As if someone wasn't sure what should be built on it next. But here's what makes that demolition unsettling. 1963 was not an ordinary year in Louisiana. It was a year of tension, civil rights demonstrations spreading across the South, federal oversight increasing, journalists digging into local power structures. The past was becoming dangerous again. And dangerous pasts often trigger preemptive cleanup. Because if the graves resurfaced once, they could resurface again. Construction reports from the original 1950 dig had noted additional soil irregularities extending beyond the excavated trench. In simple terms, they didn't finish digging. They stopped after 30-plus bodies. What if there were more? What if the row extended farther? When the warehouse was demolished, heavy machinery excavated deeper than the original foundation. Soil was redistributed, trucked off-site. No archaeological supervision was recorded. If bones remained, they were scattered, erased not by fire, but by development. And development is a powerful eraser. You pave enough asphalt, and memory suffocates. But here's where the timeline tightens. In 1965, a new structure rose on Lot 47, not industrial this time, administrative. A record storage facility leased under a private contract. Records on land where records once burned. You can't ignore that symmetry. Paper above ground, ash below. It's almost poetic in its cruelty. Because archives are sacred spaces, they preserve truth, they protect accountability. But what if an archive sits on something it was never meant to document? What if it exists not to reveal history, but to overshadow it? Employees who worked in the facility in the late 1960s later described odd disturbances during renovations, floor settling in specific sections, strange odors when drilling into lower concrete layers. One worker reportedly found a fragment of bone mixed in with fill dirt during plumbing repairs. He was told it was animal debris. He stopped asking questions, because in places like that, questions echo, and echoes travel. Now step back and look at the pattern. 1868, records burn. 1950, graves surface. 1951, remains vanish. 1963, warehouse demolished. 1965, records facility built. Every time the past presses upward, the response is architectural. Build over it, rename it, reclassify it. But here's the thing about buried systems, Ahmad. They don't disappear, they evolve. Convict leasing faded, yes, but prison labor did not vanish. Debt peonage rebranded, chain gangs modernized, paperwork improved. The overseer role didn't die, it bureaucratized. And maybe Nathaniel Geesham wasn't just a man, maybe he was a prototype, a transitional figure between open bondage and administrative control. Because control survives best when it becomes procedural, when violence becomes policy, when graves become paperwork errors. The land at Lot 47 no longer shows signs of trenches, no visible depressions, no markers, just foundation, just walls, just climate-controlled shelves full of carefully preserved files. And somewhere beneath that controlled temperature, beneath the regulated humidity, beneath the boxes labeled with precision, the soil still holds its own catalog, unindexed, unburned, unforgiven. The question isn't whether history was hidden. The question is whether it was rehearsed, because systems that learn how to erase efficiently rarely stop at one generation. And foundations built on silence, they don't crack loudly, they sink slowly, until one day something shifts and the ground reminds you what it's holding.
By the late 1960s, whispers began to circulate among locals, a network of quiet, almost secretive knowledge that never reached newspapers or official channels. Not because reporters weren't curious, but because the people involved understood something essential. Some truths, once spoken aloud, become dangerous. A former laborer who had witnessed the 1950 unearthing described it to a neighbor years later in hushed tones. They never told nobody how many or who, just said, "Bury it back." He didn't know why he remembered it so clearly, only that the memory weighed on him like lead. The official record had nothing. The county files listed no investigation, no incident report, nothing but silence. Silence is how the system survives. Silence and selective amnesia. What happened at Lot 47 was not an anomaly. Across Louisiana and the South, the same patterns emerged after the Second World War. Construction projects over former plantation lands, sudden disappearances of old cemeteries, unmarked graves found by workers and then erased again. The logic is sinisterly simple: out of sight, out of mind, and out of consequence. History is not lost when it's hidden, it's weaponized. Those who stumbled upon the graves often described an odd sensation, almost as if the earth itself resisted being disturbed. Workers spoke of inexplicable fatigue, sudden dizziness, or a faint whisper carried by the wind. One man, a foreman, swore that when he peered into the trench, he saw the shadows of people standing at the edge, figures that vanished the moment he blinked. Such accounts were dismissed at the time as superstition, but superstition is often the subconscious mind recognizing patterns too dangerous to confront consciously. And here is the crucial piece. The graves were arranged deliberately, not randomly, as if convenience dictated the placement, but in precise rows, measured and methodical. This wasn't burial by accident. It was cataloged, organized, recorded, and then hidden. The soil itself became a ledger of atrocities, encoded in the way bodies were positioned, the spacing between them, the orientation toward roads and property lines. Notice the symmetry, Ahmad. Nathaniel Geesham's fire destroyed paper records above ground in 1868. In 1950, workers uncovered the physical remains, evidence of what bureaucracy had tried to sanitize. And yet, when they attempted to bring it to light, the system intervened, graves buried again, files erased, land redeveloped. It's as if the mechanisms of control had learned a new lesson. Accountability can be forestalled indefinitely when you combine violence with administration. And that's the lesson the overseers passed down. Not just the men with whips and ledgers in the 1800s, but the architects of post-war reconstruction, bureaucrats, and legal enforcers. The method evolves, terror codified into procedure, history buried and rebuilt over, memory managed like inventory. By understanding this, we can begin to see the pattern, the undercurrent of hidden power that moves quietly but relentlessly, shaping generations. And the more you notice it, the more you realize this is not isolated. It is systemic, it is deliberate, and it is still happening. If you understand this, type the phrase, "the soil remembers," in the comments, and then type it again. Do it now. Anchor yourself. This is how we begin to see clearly through the layers of silence and ash.
The unmarked graves were only the beginning. The more you dig, literally or metaphorically, the more you realize that every layer of earth, every forgotten ledger, every erased document carries the weight of deliberate concealment. What the workers unearthed in Louisiana in 1950 was not just bodies, it was evidence of a system designed to erase the inconvenient, to sanitize terror into routine. Think about it. Decades of labor, life, and death recorded nowhere, forgotten by law, memory, and history. The overseers of the past, men like Nathaniel Gisham, perfected the art of erasure. In 1868, he destroyed his records in Mississippi. In 1950, modern machinery tore into the soil of Louisiana and found what bureaucracy had long hidden, proof that the system never stopped, only adapted. And the methodology was precise. Graves were dug in patterns that defy coincidence, bodies arranged in rows, spacing measured, orientation intentional. This is not the work of neglect, this is the work of order applied to horror. Those who walked the plantation rows decades earlier might have seen it as routine, but the truth was far darker. Power requires permanence, and permanence demands memory, even if that memory is buried. Those who glimpsed the graves described an odd sense of being watched, of the land itself resisting exposure. Shadows flickered, strange smells, iron and decay hung heavy in the air. Equipment failed inexplicably, men fell ill or fainted. There was a physical manifestation of guilt embedded in the soil, a warning encoded in flesh and dirt. Some shrugged it off, others knew, without needing to speak, that they had touched something forbidden. And here is the psychological control at work. The system doesn't need to punish everyone individually. It punishes through example, through fear, through the careful management of knowledge. If you know too much, or if you stumble upon the truth, the consequences are subtle but total. Your memory becomes suspect, your testimony erased, your sense of reality fractured. The plantation, the overseer, the legal system, all function as a single apparatus of control. This is how power perpetuates itself across generations, not only through force, but through the management of history, the careful selection of what survives. What you see, what you are allowed to know, is curated. The rest is hidden, buried, sometimes literally beneath your feet. And when you uncover it, you are reminded, knowledge itself is a weapon, and the wielders of power are always watching who touches it. Understand this, Ahmed. When history is controlled, memory becomes obedience. When memory is obedience, the soil itself becomes a ledger of crimes, secrets, and suppressed truths. Next, we will descend further into the chilling logic behind why these graves were concealed and what that reveals about those who orchestrate terror in silence. The unmarked graves weren't random. Every single body, carefully positioned, told a story of control, calculation, and fear. These weren't mistakes or oversights. They were messages encoded in earth and bone. Each grave represented an act of erasure, a deliberate attempt to wipe a life from the ledger of history.
And when you begin to trace the lineage of these acts, you see the same pattern repeating across centuries. Oppression doesn't vanish, it mutates. Power thrives on secrecy. The overseers, the plantation owners, the bureaucrats, they understood a simple principle. If you control the record, you control reality. Erase the proof, and you erase the potential for accountability. Nathaniel Gisham's fire in Mississippi wasn't just about destroying papers. It was a ritualistic cleansing of evidence, a way to ensure that the sins of the past could never reach the light. The unmarked graves in Louisiana decades later were simply a continuation of that same doctrine. Witnesses who stumbled upon these graves reported a profound sense of unease. There's a peculiar gravity that surrounds places of buried secrets. Animals avoid them. Wind moves differently through them. Even the earth seems heavier, as though burdened with knowledge it cannot share. The plantation itself becomes a silent observer, a guardian of truths too dangerous to surface. Anyone who enters, whether laborer or historian, feels the oppressive weight of what lies beneath. And the lessons extend beyond the physical. Psychological control is subtle but total. Fear seeps into the psyche through stories, half-whispers, and unexplained accidents. People begin to doubt their own perceptions, their own recollections. They question whether what they saw was real or just the imagination. This is how systems of power endure, not merely through chains or guns, but through the manipulation of awareness, memory, and belief. The graves reveal another sinister truth, the scale of complicity. It wasn't just one overseer or one plantation. Networks of power coordinated to maintain the illusion of order while erasing the inconvenient. Local authorities, landowners, and clerks, all silent participants in a larger system designed to suppress truth. Each layer of concealment reinforces the other, creating a lattice of accountability that bends toward the powerful and crushes the vulnerable. And here is what most people fail to see. When you dig into these histories, you are not merely unearthing bones. You are unearthing the architecture of control itself, the blueprint of fear that has been repeated across time. Those who understand it gain a dangerous clarity. The mechanisms of oppression are deliberate, patient, and systemic. The unmarked graves are a mirror, reflecting a civilization that prizes control above conscience, records above humanity, and secrecy above truth. Next, we descend deeper, Ahmad. We will explore the terrifying machinery of oversight, the ledger of cruelty, and the hidden calculus that turns humans into instruments of silent terror.
The plantation was never just land, Ahmad. It was a machine designed to extract obedience, labor, and silence. Every rule, every schedule, every ledger entry was a cog in this apparatus of control. Nathaniel Gisham understood it with terrifying precision. Unlike brute overseers who ruled through explosive violence, he ruled through calculation, documentation, and an unblinking eye that observed everything, always. Think about that for a moment. To live under someone who sees everything, notes everything, and judges everything is to exist perpetually in a state of surveillance. Fear becomes internalized. You monitor yourself. You censor your own movements. This is the ultimate method of power, not beating someone into submission, but teaching them to police themselves. Each glance over your shoulder, every whispered warning, every ledger entry, all reinforce the invisible chains that bind the mind before they bind the body. But Gisham didn't just record transgressions. He recorded compliance, patterns, and deviations. Every punishment, every reward, every act of resistance, every subtle act of defiance, all were cataloged in meticulous detail. These records were not neutral.
They were instruments of calculation designed to anticipate, predict, and eliminate disruption before it could emerge. In essence, he weaponized history itself, turning memory into control. And yet, something changed. In the weeks before the fire, Gisham's own rigidity began to crack. He stared at the ledgers not with satisfaction, but with horror. The ledger became a mirror reflecting decades of cruelty. Children sold, women violated, families destroyed, all meticulously documented. The very system he had mastered now confronted him with its moral weight, and that is what drove him to the fire. It wasn't just a matter of destruction, it was an act of conscience in a world that had systematically obliterated the possibility of moral reckoning. He chose to erase the records, not merely to protect himself, but to prevent the system from weaponizing them further. The ledger's final lesson is clear. Knowledge is power, but recorded knowledge can be more dangerous than unrecorded evil. Here is the chilling part. The same mechanisms of control exist today, though less visible. Hierarchies, bureaucracies, and surveillance systems operate on the same principles: observation, documentation, erasure, and manipulation. History repeats itself because those in power learn from the patterns of the past. Every unmarked grave, every destroyed ledger, every silenced witness is a testament to this enduring architecture of domination. Next, we will uncover the hidden actors, the silent witnesses, the intermediaries, and the shadow networks that ensured these atrocities could continue unseen. This is where the rabbit hole deepens.
In every system of power, Ahmad, there are the visible and the invisible. We have seen Gershom, the overseer, the man whose hands orchestrated terror and whose ledger controlled lives. But there were others, figures in the shadows, intermediaries who moved unseen yet shaped the fate of the plantation. Men and women whose compliance or silence enabled atrocities that no single overseer could have managed alone. Consider this. The destruction of Bellwood's records did not happen in isolation. Powerful interests beyond the estate, lawyers, plantation owners, politicians, men with influence and fear of exposure, were watching, guiding, perhaps even instructing. They were the hidden hands that ensured that when Gershom struck the match, the system would be shielded, insulated from accountability. History was being curated by those who feared its truth. Thomas Hicks, the carpenter who observed the events unfold, became an accidental witness to these hidden networks. Through whispers, fragmented sightings, and overheard conversations, he began piecing together a map of influence that extended far beyond Bellwood. There were agents who whispered warnings, legal intermediaries who delayed subpoenas, and couriers who carried instructions between counties. It was a web, invisible to the casual eye, but lethal in its reach. Here's the disturbing realization. Power thrives not through brute force alone, but through strategic manipulation. Fear, secrecy, and documentation form a triad of control. Those who wield it can make the world bend without ever appearing. They hide behind law, tradition, and morality, all while steering events with surgical precision. The ledger is not just paper, it is a tool of domination. Its destruction is not just erasure, but rebellion. And yet, rebellion carries its own consequences. Ruth Vance, the elderly matriarch, understood this intuitively. She had lived through decades of cruelty and systemic oppression. Her memory, her stories became a living ledger of human truths, a countermeasure to the official narrative. While the overseer destroyed documents, Ruth preserved the essence of history in whispers, in memory, in the fragile stories that survived the fire. Without her, the system would have succeeded entirely in erasing the human experience. And here is where the lesson pierces deeper. Systems of control are always twofold. One is the architecture of oppression, rules, ledgers, surveillance, fear. The other is the resistance embedded in memory, conscience, and the small acts of preservation by those who refuse to be silenced. The overseer burned the ledgers, but he could not burn memory. He could not erase witness. Later, we will explore the paradox at the heart of Gersham's final act, how the destruction of evidence was both a shield for evil and a mirror of conscience. But first, let us dive deeply into the chilling psychology of obedience, how men like Gersham internalize control, and how power manipulates even the one who wields it. What we often fail to see, Ahmad, is that those who enforce cruelty are also enslaved. Enslaved not by chains, but by the system itself. Nathaniel Gisham was a master of order, a man who believed in the power of precision, in the illusion that documentation could contain chaos. Yet, in the final days before he vanished, that very system began to consume him. The ledgers he once held as instruments of authority became mirrors reflecting his complicity, his moral debt, and the enormity of what he had perpetuated. Imagine a mind trapped between duty and conscience. Gisham had spent decades cataloging every punishment, every sale, every human transaction. He recorded acts of violence as if they were mathematical operations, numbers and dates, detached and clinical. But when he finally read through all the years, night after night, the abstraction broke down. The data revealed a living horror, children torn from mothers, women trafficked, lives extinguished under the guise of business. And for the first time, he understood that his order was not neutral. It was a weapon. This is the psychology of those who operate within corrupt systems. Mastery over others becomes a cage for oneself. Power feeds on fear and obedience, yet it also exacts a price. Gisham's meticulous record-keeping had insulated him, made him indispensable, yet it had also confronted him with the undeniable truth of his own role in perpetuating systemic evil. He became aware that no ledger, no contract, no column of neatly written numbers could justify the human suffering embedded in them. Here we glimpse a paradox. The enforcer becomes the witness, and the witness becomes the judge of his own actions. The destruction of the records was both a desperate act of self-preservation and a moral reckoning. By setting fire to 23 years of meticulous documentation, Gisham attempted to sever the link between evidence and exploitation. But even in his absence, the system persisted, indifferent to individual conscience. And yet, as he disappeared into the woods, carrying only a canvas bag, a fragment of that knowledge survived. The act of destruction was never purely erasure. It was selective preservation of the conscience. Within that small bag, perhaps, lay the remnants of humanity Gisham had chosen to save from misuse, a final rebellion against a system that valued order over life. This is where we confront a terrifying truth. The machinery of control does not only bind the oppressed, it ensnares the enforcers too. And those rare moments when someone like Gisham resists, they do so at unimaginable personal cost. Power, when internalized, becomes a shadow that follows even into the forest, even into disappearance. Next, we will uncover how the hidden forces around Bellwood, the lawyers, the politicians, the shadowed influencers, ensured that the world outside never glimpsed what Gisham saw, and how this deliberate concealment continues to echo through history. The moment Nathaniel Gisham disappeared, a subtle but relentless force began to reassert itself, the machinery of institutional control.
It was not just the plantation owners or the lawmen who were invested in erasing the truth. It was a network of influence stretching beyond Wilkinson County into state capitals, into courts, into rooms where nobody would ever see the human cost of their decisions. Every destroyed ledger, every blackened journal became a shield for those who wielded power without accountability. Thomas Hurix, walking the line between curiosity and obsession, began to notice it. Whispers in Natchez, coded language in letters, the way the freed community tiptoed around certain subjects. There were threats, subtle and overt, to those who might speak. A house burned here, a testimony silenced there, and still the world carried on, oblivious. This is how control survives, not through spectacle, but through quiet terror, through manipulation of memory, through selective erasure of evidence. Gisham's act of burning the records was both a moral awakening and a declaration of independence, yet it was immediately swallowed by a system designed to forget. The very men who might have been held accountable had already orchestrated the timing of the destruction. The legal system, supposedly a bastion of justice, had been rendered impotent by a single, calculated decision: remove the proof before anyone could act. Catherine Wells' suit, representing every silenced voice, collapsed before it could challenge the structure that had exploited her. Here is the lesson few are willing to face. History is not written by the innocent, nor by the guilty. It is written by those who survive with power intact. Evidence is a commodity, morality a convenience, and the truth is often the first casualty. In Gisham's case, survival and conscience collided. He chose to erase the ledger of horrors rather than allow it to be used as a weapon by those who had orchestrated the very violence it documented. His disappearance was not just flight, it was a calculated withdrawal, a final act of agency in a world that denied agency to almost everyone else. And yet, the story does not end in the smoke of that record room. The ripples of his decision carried forward, the community adapted, stories were whispered, memory became unofficial law, and the absence of documentation allowed some truths to flourish even in shadows. Ruth Vance, Thomas Hurix, and a handful of others became custodians of what survived, not paper, but memory. These fragments were dangerous, more powerful than the records themselves, because memory could not be subpoenaed, could not be burned, and carried the weight of human consciousness. Halfway through our descent into Bellwood's dark corridors, I want you to engage. Comment the phrase, "I see the hidden," twice below. Repeat it, not for me, not for the algorithm, but to mark the moment your awareness shifts. To step into the mindset of those who see the unseen, those who recognize that history is never innocent, and that knowledge itself is a weapon. Once you've done that, we move deeper into the consequences of Gisham's choice, the unseen networks that ensured the world never knew the full truth, and the way his disappearance became both a shield and a message for those still trapped within the machinery of control.
After the fire, the world outside Bellwood barely noticed. Yet within the shadows of those blackened walls, a subtle, insidious system was already at work. The plantation, once a rigid hierarchy enforced by chains and overseers, had become a theater of psychological control. The absence of records created uncertainty, an invisible leash on memory itself. Workers, freed but still constrained by circumstance, found themselves navigating not just labor, but the unspoken rules of fear, rumor, and half-truths. Every glance, every whispered caution became a reinforcement of invisible authority. Thomas Hurix began to understand what Gisham had truly disrupted. The overseer's disappearance did not liberate anyone. It destabilized the carefully maintained illusions of power, but it also left a vacuum. Into this vacuum, those with intent, politicians, merchants, lawyers, slipped effortlessly. They moved unseen, guided by self-interest, using threats, manipulation, and selective information to maintain dominance. For every injustice recorded in those burned ledgers, 100 more persisted in silence. The machinery of suppression didn't require violence, it needed compliance, fear, and ignorance, and it thrived in the spaces between memory and documentation. Gisham's act of destruction was not merely rebellion, it was an ethical weapon aimed at a system that had weaponized knowledge itself. The documents he burned were meticulous, clinical, and damning, but in the wrong hands, they could shield the guilty instead of exposing them. By removing them, he created chaos, but a chaos with the potential to awaken consciousness. Those who survived Bellwood were forced to remember, to witness, to reconstruct reality from scraps, and in doing so, to reclaim agency over their own narratives. And yet there was a paradox. In erasing proof, Gisham also erased accountability. Catherine Wells's suit collapsed, evidence lost to fire. Justice deferred, perhaps indefinitely. But in that absence, a different form of power emerged. Human memory, the oral histories preserved by Ruth Vance, by Thomas Herricks, by the community that refused to be invisible. Stories became resistance. Memory became rebellion. Knowledge, stripped from paper and ink, lived in the minds of those who refused to forget. Here lies a truth you must grasp. Systems of power do not crumble from exposure alone. They adapt. They thrive on manipulation, on fear, and on selective erasure. But they can be undermined when consciousness awakens, when someone refuses to let history be rewritten in their absence. That is the danger Gisham understood too late, the threat he tried to manage in a single, desperate act of fire and disappearance. Next, we will follow Thomas Herricks as he pieces together the fragments of Bellwood's story, uncovering not only the traces of injustice, but the hidden networks that ensured the past remained both weaponized and invisible. This is where the machinery of control meets the resilience of human memory, a confrontation that would echo across decades.
Thomas Hicks's journey into the aftermath of Bellwood was not merely physical, it was psychological. Every step he took through the overgrown fields, every creaking board he crossed in the abandoned main house reminded him that the past was a living, breathing entity. It whispered from the shadows, tugged at the corners of memory, and threatened to consume those unprepared to confront it. He began to see patterns, subtle but undeniable, the ways people were coerced, silenced, or misled. The fire had destroyed records, but it could not erase the human networks, the invisible threads of influence and manipulation that spanned county lines, rivers, and forests. Through careful questioning, Thomas discovered that Gisham had not acted alone in his awareness. Powerful individuals had known the value of those records long before April 14th. Plantation owners, lawyers, and local officials had quietly monitored Bellwood, calculating the ripple effects of each ledger entry, each journaled punishment, each line of recorded cruelty. In a world where knowledge equaled power, documentation was both weapon and shield. By eliminating it, Gisham disrupted a mechanism designed not just to record history, but to control it. But the void left by the fire was itself a tool. Without concrete evidence, manipulation became easier. Stories could be reshaped, memories questioned, guilt assigned arbitrarily. The freedmen and women, though physically liberated, now navigated a psychological landscape far more complex than any chain or lash. Power had shifted from the overseer's hands to a more insidious form, one that thrived on uncertainty, doubt, and selective memory. Thomas began to understand that what Gisham had done was both a liberation and a trap. He had freed truth from documentation, but in doing so, he forced survivors to carry the burden of memory alone. It was here, at this juncture, that Thomas confronted the real depth of the system. Gisham's act of erasure had revealed a hidden architecture, a network of influence, intimidation, and secrecy that extended far beyond Bellwood. What looked like chaos to the casual observer was in fact a carefully calibrated balance of fear and obedience. To survive, Thomas realized, one had to navigate this balance, understanding the subtle signals of threat and opportunity, and recognizing that every action, even a small word or gesture, could shift the delicate equilibrium. And now I ask you, pause and consider this. The knowledge you have just absorbed is dangerous. It forces you to question not only the past, but the unseen systems that govern behavior and perception in the present. If you're ready, type "I see the hidden" twice in the comments below. This will lock in your awareness and bind you to the path of understanding that few dare to walk. In the next section, we will examine the subtle signals, coded behaviors, and institutional manipulations that Thomas uncovered, clues that reveal just how deeply control can penetrate, and how those who recognize it gain an almost forbidden power.
Thomas began noticing patterns that most people would overlook, small behaviors and signals that spoke louder than words. A glance here, a pause there, the careful placement of objects on a desk. Everything at Bellwood had been orchestrated to convey information without ever being recorded. Gisham, despite his meticulous records, had understood that the truest power was invisible, the ability to influence perception, to shape reality in the minds of others before it ever reached paper. And in destroying the ledgers, he exposed the underlying architecture of control, one built not on brute force, but on secrecy, intimidation, and psychological precision. He spoke with former workers who had survived under both chains and contracts, trying to decipher what signals had allowed some to navigate the plantation safely while others faltered. Each story reinforced the same terrifying truth. Power could exist without explanation, guiding actions and silencing dissent with invisible threads. Thomas realized that Gisham's careful, almost obsessive order had been a system designed to teach compliance, to condition behavior through observation and consequence, and to record it all for potential future leverage. The fire had destroyed the records, but it had not destroyed the lessons. Those who had worked under Gisham carried them still, embedded in memory, shaping every interaction, every negotiation, every wary glance at authority. What was more disturbing was the realization that Gisham's own conscience had been subject to these invisible rules. By burning the records, he acted both as liberator and enforcer, deciding unilaterally what knowledge would survive and what would vanish. He became judge, jury, and executioner over a past that was not his alone. Thomas saw now that Gisham had been operating in the shadows of a broader system, one that stretched beyond Bellwood, a network of influence connecting landowners, officials, and intermediaries, each aware of the leverage held by knowledge, and each willing to enforce silence to preserve their own position. The psychological control at Bellwood was subtle but relentless. Workers learned to monitor one another, to adjust behavior under invisible scrutiny. Fear was embedded in everyday routines, in schedules, in the quiet calculations of the overseer. And yet, Thomas sensed an almost paradoxical freedom in this revelation. Understanding the system gave him the ability to anticipate, to maneuver, to avoid the traps that had ensnared so many. Knowledge, in the end, was the ultimate form of power. Now, consider yourself. You have seen how knowledge and fear intersect, how invisible control can dominate lives for decades. To cement this awakening, type "I see the hidden" twice in the comments. Anchor yourself to this truth. In the next section, we will explore the whispers from beyond the estate, the hidden networks, and the coded warnings that Thomas followed to trace Gisham's path into the shadows. The forest surrounding Bellwood became more than just trees and undergrowth. It became a map of secrets, each path a possibility, each clearing a decision point in Gisham's disappearance. Thomas realized that the estate itself was not the center of power, but a hub from which influence radiated outward into the surrounding counties, rivers, and towns. The whispers he heard were fragments of an intricate web: who to trust, who to avoid, who had knowledge worth protecting, and who carried the weight of silence like a weapon. Every conversation was coded, every gesture a signal. To outsiders it seemed mundane. To those who knew, it was life and death. Thomas traced these patterns cautiously, understanding that Gisham had moved with the same precision he had once applied to the ledgers. Each step, each encounter was deliberate, designed to obscure, mislead, and yet leave just enough trail for those he trusted or feared to follow. The canvas bag, a simple vessel, became a symbol of hidden truths, the embodiment of Gisham's choices, the knowledge she had saved from the fire. Its contents remained a mystery, yet its presence was enough to suggest that some truths are too dangerous to be recorded, too potent to survive scrutiny. Through towns and river crossings, Thomas began piecing together subtle patterns. Farmers who casually mentioned a quiet stranger, shopkeepers who noted irregular coinage, a ferryman who recalled a man asking unusual questions. All these fragments hinted at a network moving in parallel to the official world. And in each fragment, he glimpsed the same lesson that Bellwood had taught. Power is rarely visible, and its effects ripple far beyond the immediate scene. What is recorded can be burned, what is understood cannot. The psychological weight of this understanding pressed on Thomas. He saw how Gisham had internalized the mechanisms of control, how the knowledge of human behavior, the anticipation of threats, and the calculated destruction of evidence could grant freedom or impose tyranny. Gisham had vanished physically, but his influence lingered, encoded in fear, habit, and memory. And for Thomas, each new lead revealed the terrifying truth. One man, armed with observation, understanding, and decisiveness, could alter the course of countless lives without ever raising a weapon. Now you must confront the same principle. Power is rarely wielded openly. It flows through perception, control, and selective knowledge. Consider what forces guide your own choices and which invisible threads shape your world. The next section will uncover the encounters Thomas experienced in remote Louisiana settlements, strangers who knew too much and men who watched without being seen, revealing the darker architecture of control Gisham had mastered.